On the early morning of November 7th, 1825, in Frankfort, Kentucky, Jereboam Beauchamp stabbed Kentucky Legislator Solomon Sharp in an event that would become known as the Kentucky Tragedy.
I then replied in a soft, conciliating, and persuasive tone of voice, "Come to the light, Colonel, and you will know me." And pulling him by the arm, he came readily to the door. I stepped with one foot back upon the first step out of the door, and still holding his wrist in my left hand, I stripped my hat and handkerchief from over my forehead and looked right up in Colonel Sharp's face. He knew me the more readily, I imagine, by my long, bushy, curly suit of hair. He sprang back and exclaimed in the deepest tone of astonishment, dismay, horror, and despair I ever heard,
"It's him!"
And as he said that, he fell on his knees, after failing to jerk loose his wrist from my grasp. As he fell on his knees, I let go of his wrist and grasped his throat. And dashing upon the facing of the door, I choked him to keep him from howling, and muttered in his face, "Die, you villain." And as I said that, I plunged the dagger to his heart.
Such is the story recounted by Jereboam Beauchamp, the murderer of Solomon Sharp. But did the murder really occur as Beauchamp explained in his sensational confessions? Join us today for a special discussion of one of Kentucky's most notorious murders, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the Associate Editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, a scholarly journal and publication since 1903. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which supports researcher visits to our campus from around the world. Dr. Matthew Schoenbachler is a professor of history at the University of North Alabama. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Kentucky and has co-authored a book and published in the Journal of the Early Republic. We're delighted to talk with him today about his book, Murder and Madness, The Myth of the Kentucky Tragedy, which was published in 2009. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we delve into the murder itself, I always like to ask about the origin stories for books. So how did you happen to embark on writing a book about the Kentucky Tragedy? Were you familiar with the story, or was this something that you came across after you began studying at the University of Kentucky?
Oh, it was something I first heard about after coming to the University of Kentucky, and after I was embarked on my dissertation, which was a history of the Relief War, the political battles of the 1820s. If I remember right, a friend of mine, Greg Friend, he loaned me a copy of Robert Penn Warren's World Enough in Time. He said, "Hey, might want to read this. It's set during your era." And so I came to the Kentucky Tragedy the way most people do, which is by way of fiction. I read Robert Penn Warren, loved it, and went on to read most of all of his other novels. Really like Warren's work. But since I was doing a dissertation on the broader political atmosphere, I sort of set it aside. But about a few years later, after I'd started teaching at Kentucky Wesleyan College, I was going through I think I was at the Kentucky Historical Society, and Tom Appleton, the former editor of the Register, was there. And I asked him, I said, "Tom, is anyone doing work on this Kentucky tragedy?" And he said, "Not that I know of." And I said, "Well, someone ought to do it." So I started around 2000, I believe, researching this event. And that led me across, of course, a number of archives across the state. And so I came to it by way of fiction, to answer your question.
It's a pretty grisly story. And so one of the reasons I was looking into, okay, is there someone we could interview and talk to about a murder or something? And that's how I happened to stumble across your book. And I was really glad I did, because it fits so many things perfectly. To give you the backstory, I actually was Googling Edgar Allan Poe in Kentucky. And then this was one of the first things that popped up. So I found that somewhat amusing. Without delving into the characters too much, because I do want to set up the backstory in just a little bit for folks who might not be familiar with what the Kentucky Tragedy was. But could you tell us what happened in the early morning in November of 1825 in Frankfort, Kentucky?
Well, a young man had ridden into town the evening before. His name was Jereboam Beauchamp, and he had basically, the next day, the General Assembly was convening. So the town is packed full of people. He can't find a place to stay. So he winds up in, of all places, staying with the Kentucky State Warden, the night of the murder. He sneaks out, and about 11 o'clock, he hovers around the old State House, which actually was not there. It was had just burned to the ground, and the old one had not quite been built yet. But around 1 o'clock in the morning, he creeps into the side of this house that was owned by Solomon Sharp, and he was determined to kill Solomon Sharp. He knocked on the door, and when Sharp came, he did not open the door. He said, "Who is it?" He says, he gave a name, and he says, "I'm not sure I know you." And he says, "No, it's something." So Sharp opens the door. Beauchamp then takes out a knife, and in his telling, it's a melodramatic story of, "I've come to avenge my wife, you sorry son of a," and stabs him in the stomach. Sharp he never says anything. It was a very serious wound, obviously. It killed him almost instantly. And he died without saying another word. So from his perspective, he just woke up, answered the door, got stabbed. His wife is right behind him, so she's looking at this, and she sees him fall to the ground and begins to scream. And before long, the entire Frankfort learns what had happened, that someone had come to the door and killed one of the most prominent politicians in all of Kentucky. A man who, by the way, was about to be, by most accounts, elected the Speaker of the House of the Kentucky Assembly the very next morning. And so this was big news that he was murdered.
That was one of the things I really enjoyed about the book. I think being in Frankfort, Kentucky, here and coming into work every day, as I was reading it, I was going, "Oh, that's right. That's right here." And I could kind of picture, even though some of the buildings, as you mentioned, are no longer there, I can still, like the old state capitol now, you can kind of figure out, okay, this is where it was. So I think the setting was really, really interesting.
It is really interesting. I mean, it happens within a very compact area. And I've walked around Frankfurt many times trying to figure out, okay, he was staying here. He in fact was staying at the house that Beauchamp stayed at that night, the warden, which is further evidence of how poorly planned this whole thing was. You just don't go into town to commit a murder and go stay with the superintendent of the state penitentiary, but he did. But where that house stood is not terribly far from Kentucky Historical Society. I think was in what is now a parking lot, slightly to the west of the society. And the house itself, in which Sharp owned and in which he was murdered, that house was torn down in the 1970s to make way for that federal building that is right next to the old State House today. So you can just wander around and you can see, and there was John Crittenden, and he lived over there, and it was like 3 blocks away. So Crittenden and all the other guys would have come very quickly, as they did, when the alarm went out that there's been a murder of a prominent man in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I really did. One of the things I really enjoyed was the setting, because you got that vibe of, okay, here's what's happening, smallish town. But I think for those, like you were saying, who are familiar with Frankfort, know it's a very interesting town just because it's smallish, but when politicians roll into town, a lot has happened here. So it's also a very, very historical.
Most of the year it's just a sleepy little town, and then in late November or early November, it just exploded with activity.
Yeah. So that leads us to getting into the actual people within this story. So as I was reading, you did a great job with the background, but I did want to quickly sort of separate this out just so our listeners don't get too confused if they aren't familiar with the story. So I thought, let's start with Solomon Sharp, the victim of the story. Who was he, and how does he fit into this political scene in Frankfort? Because as you really do a good job of drawing out, it's really his political career that ends up getting him in so much trouble.
Well, he was born in Virginia in the year the Constitution was written, 1787, and his family was very poor. They moved out to Kentucky in the 1790s when he was still young, and he grew up without much of an education, but apparently he really had a father that had high hopes for all of his children, and apparently pressed them. All of his sons and daughters were very, very successful, or married very, very successful men, and even though the father himself had not much of an estate himself, but he read law, and incredibly, for a poor kid growing up in Western Kentucky, and by the way, they moved out to Logan County, which is out in the western part. That's the wild, wild west of the day. And he, by the age of 21, has impressed enough people that he's elected to the state assembly at the age of 21. You know, and most people who are juniors or seniors in college or just starting off their careers, and he gets elected to the assembly, which is, by the way, illegal, because you're supposed to, according to the 1799 Constitution, you're supposed to be 24. But I guess they just waved that off. And so he's actually starting his political career very, very early here in 1809. By 3 years later, at the age of 24, he's elected to Congress, which again is technically illegal because he's not 25 as the Constitution stipulates when he was elected, although he turned 25 shortly thereafter. And so he serves 2 terms in Congress and is very active. And if you read the debates of Congress, you see Sharp's name come up quite often. He was, despite his youth, he was very, very outspoken. He served in a military capacity during the War of 1812, not very long, but it was enough to get him a title of colonel, which of course was great political use back in the day. And he then returned to the Kentucky General Assembly for a couple of years, then retired to become a lawyer at the ripe old age of 32, and was then talked into becoming the state attorney general during the Relief War. And so he spent 1821, 22, 23, 24 as the attorney general when all this political mess is absolutely exploding. And this has bearing on the murder itself, because you can't understand the murder without the context of politics, which I'll get in a little bit more later. But in 1825, and this was momentous, he was talked into running for the Kentucky General Assembly again because the opposition party had nominated John C. Crittenden. Now, Crittenden was one of Kentucky's great politicians, and of course, he will later go on to be Henry Clay's protege and successor in the U.S. Senate and play a key role in the coming of the Civil War, or the attempt to keep it from coming. But anyway, he actually defeats Crittenden for a seat in the Kentucky General Assembly, and the night before he was to take office, he was murdered. And now, as we'll see, that it's not a coincidence that his return to politics and his murder happened at the same time. So he had left behind a wife and 3 small children, and his wife never remarried. He had an adoring brother who was a confirmed bachelor and lived with him, and it just really devastated not only the town of Kentucky, but that family when he was murdered in November of 25.
I felt very unaccomplished when I saw his sort of rise to power of how young he was. It did. I was like, I was in graduate school at this time as he's helping to run the state. So you wrote that the Beauchamps were as aberrant, deviant, and bizarre individuals as early America ever produced, which I really like that line. But I know this is a broad question because there's so many moving parts here. But can you sketch out Jereboam and Anna's stories? Who were they, and when did they decide to strike out at poor Solomon Sharp?
Well, they're both very interesting. Anna's quite interesting as well. She was also like Sharp, born in Virginia, but she was born to a very elite household. Her family was very well connected, had a great deal of wealth, but they were in decline, the family was. And although they had connections with Dolly Payne Madison's family and were, I believe, might have claimed to own maybe 50 enslaved people. They really had wealth, but their fortunes quickly declined, especially when the father, Giles Cook, he died in 1805, when Anna was 20 years old. Now, so she's been raised in a very privileged circumstances, and that at the age 20, when many young women are getting married and starting their lives, that she has to deal with this tragedy. And it was not just a personal tragedy, but financial tragedy for the family. Within a few years, all of the family has moved out to Kentucky. It was kind of a serial migration. We know she was there by 1807. And so where they were back in the beautiful world of Tidewater, Virginia, now they're out in the frontier of Kentucky trying to recoup their fortunes. And what she does for the next 13 years or so, from about '07 to 20, is kind of vague. But what she doesn't do is more significant, at least for the time. She does not get married. And by many accounts, she was what Victoria Bynum called an unruly woman. That is, she really refused to obey the gender dictates of her day. There's evidence that she was a close follower of Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was questioning not just gender constraints, but all sorts of aspects of society. And then she was, and again, we're using documents here from people who were very hostile towards her, but she does seem to be sexually liberated for her day. And she certainly had this reputation as being, quote unquote, a loose woman. In 1820, she says she became pregnant and then identified Solomon Sharp as the father. Now, so this is after Sharp left the General Assembly, before he became the state attorney general, and there was a scandal in the area when she named Solomon Sharp. What is interesting is there was all the family, Sharp and his brother, did was say, look, this is a loose woman. There is no need for me even to defend ourselves or my brother Sharp. There's no reason to even defend the conduct, because we know what kind of woman she was. There's no telling whose baby that was, according to the dictates of the day. And she was actually absolutely devastated about this, of course. She gives birth to a child in mid-1820, and it seems as if the child was what we call today cyanotic. That is, was born with a heart defect, which lends a darker hue to the skin, a sort of a blue baby that they call today. Later, this gets translated into it was not a white child. And for the day and age, this is a big scandal, and that is what is going to help kick off all of this. But for our purposes, she has the baby is unwell and dies soon thereafter. Then you have a second individual, Jereboam Beauchamp. Now, he was born in 1802, so understand he's 17 years younger than Anna Cook Beauchamp, his future wife. And he is pretty much a wild thing from day one. See, by all accounts, he's born in the frontier of Kentucky. He is very, very bright, but is also very, very like Anna, a very, very unruly person. And he develops reputation as being pretty volatile, even violent. But he is very brilliant, and he is brilliant. And so he becomes a lawyer by age 21, and actually is pretty good at it. But he meets and forms a relationship with Anna Cook. Now, the relationship started as early as 1820, 1821. They don't get married until 1824, but their relationship, when they did meet, as he talks about and she talks about, is premised in large part on their shared love of literature. And this is key to understanding what happens in the course of the events.
And that leads really nicely into my next question, which is, one thing that struck me about the book is that it's not simply the story of a murder. It is a tale of how a couple tried to create sympathy with the public and frame their illegal acts in a favorable light. I was fascinated, and I really mean this. It was just an interesting sort of unpacking of Romanticism and the role it plays in all of this. So how did this couple try to hook into literary Romanticism to win over the sympathy of the public?
Well, what they do, there was two main literary modes in the early Republic, or two major literary modes. And one was coded as masculine, the other was coded as feminine. The masculine literary stereotype of the day had to do with something called the Byronic hero. And there was, and historians across the spectrum, historians, literary critics, agree that there was this Byromania of the early 19th century, and that Byron was a hugely influential figure, not just in poetry, but in the young men's, especially young men's self-conception, the way they dressed, the way they acted, the way they behaved. And they would adopt this sort of moody stance of this young person weighted down by some horrible secret in their past. It's all very romantic. And you can see this in various generations. You can think of, people young men emulating Elvis back in the 50s and the 60s, of course. And you have something similar happening here with Byron. And we know that both Anna and Jeroboam were great close readers of Byron, and knew very well of this literary trope of the Byronic hero. The other great romantic theme of the day was feminine. And in the feminine stereotype, the story was of a young, virtuous, usually orphaned, beautiful young woman who was seduced and abandoned by a horrible villain of a man. There were whereas poetry was the main conduit of the Byronic hero, it was novels that was the conduit of the seduction story. And two novels in particular were very, very popular. Charlotte Temple and The Coquette, and they went through dozens and dozens and dozens of editions, publications throughout the antebellum era, and it was just a well-known theme. Everyone knew it. It would be sort of like, a theme of zombies today. I mean, it just was, for whatever reason, was extraordinarily popular, and you couldn't throw a rock without hitting the story that played on this theme. And so what they do, now their shared love of literature is really what brings them together in many ways, despite their 17-year difference, despite their different upbringings, very different upbringings. And that literature, I argue, served as a means that they connected. Now, after Jereboam kills Solomon Sharp, he initially denies it, of course. And when it goes to trial, his defense is, well, I didn't do it. When he is convicted and sentenced to death 7 weeks later, he then, with Anna's help, begins to write this confession that has become by far the most well-known document of the case. And this confession is a self-conscious blending of a Byronic hero and a seduced and abandoned maiden. And they basically concoct this story using these themes that everyone knew, hoping to get this story published in time to avert the execution, to get a pardon, and to escape the hangman's noose. They almost pulled it off. They got it published a week or two before the execution. It was published in Kentucky, but it did not get enough attention initially to prevent their execution. And on the day they were sentenced to die, they both stabbed themselves, and her attempt succeeded, his did not, and he was hanged in early July of 1826. And that would have been the end of it, except for that confession. And that confession then went on and became published and republished and had a life of its own. And before a few years were out, you had this Kentucky tragedy spread throughout the United States, and people lapped it up because it told them what they wanted to hear, that, oh my goodness, Byronic heroes really do exist. Byronic heroes who avenge virtuous, seduced maidens really do exist. And it just caught on fire. And then from there, you see about 7 or 8 different plays written, including by Edgar Allan Poe. You see about 5 or 6 novels just in America written on this theme. There are also, by the way, a number of plays and novels that are written in England as well, but it's a variant on the story, and so I don't talk about it much in the book. But none of these dramatizations are very successful as literature. And what I argue is because they're retelling a story already. It's a stale story to begin with. The original fictionalization of this murder was Jeroboam's and Anna's confession. And then when you try to make a fictionalization of a fictionalization, things really don't work out that well. And so it's incredibly popular throughout this time period, but most people don't know about these plays and books because they just weren't that, good. But there is one great exception, and that, of course, is the 20th century novel of Robert Penn Warren, published in 1950. And Warren, he understood that there was something very, shall we say, performative about what Anna and Jeroboam were doing it. And he works that into his novel, and that's one reason why it's so brilliant. The other reason, by the way, is that Warren did an amazing job researching this novel. I was in the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives right after I'd started this project, and I'd gotten the case files for the trial. And this big box came down, and it has all these files. But then there are paper clipped these notes written in ballpoint pens. So obviously it's much more recent than the documents themselves. And I'm thinking, who had wrote all this stuff? Who had went through and rifled through all these documents from the original case, and eventually I came upon one note, and it basically asked a question and then said ... RPW, and I'm like, of course. I say Robert Penn Warren was here. He was doing that research. It's really an exceptional treatment of the book, and again, it was my entree into the entire subject. I highly recommend the book to anyone, but it's not exactly what happened. If you want to know what happened, then you read my book.
One of the things, and you sort of touched on this, but I found it just really interesting, is how careful you have to be with sources, just because, as you were mentioning, there's a lot written about this. I think what I found interesting, and this was sort of an aside, but it was the extent to which there's really not a mystery at the heart of this. He's not a very good criminal. I mean, you really draw that out very well, is that he's caught very quickly. There's really no suspense about it, but people do spin these stories about, motive and why he's doing it. And so it's not really a whodunit so much as, okay, here's an explanation. As a historian, how do you sort of go through those sources, and how do you tackle more literary sources, or are things where there's really no dispute, okay, this individual did this more than likely. I mean, there is a little dispute, but at this time, and this is how he did it, but this is sort of my motive. How do you sort of weigh those things, and how do you get at sources when you're trying to deal with something that's so literary?
Well, it is difficult because almost from the beginning, what the fictional and the non-fictional get, the boundary between the two gets blurry very quickly. One of the first things you can see is when the story goes out and from newspaper to newspaper, and thanks to digital collections now, you can find exactly who's picking up which story, which paper, and then you can actually see editors. So like a newspaper in Pennsylvania picks it up from a newspaper in Kentucky. But when they pick it up, they start adding to it. They start actually editorializing and adding a little more information that, of course, they're just making up to make it still more dramatic. And then you see it get picked up by a newspaper in New York, and it happens again. And so when you go to the primary source material, at once you're faced with this problem. How much of this is actual, and how much of this is the sort of amateur novelization of these editors? And then things get so blurred after a while that, for example, in 1963, there's a really useful primary document collection on the Kentucky tragedy that was published by Bobbs Merrill, a very good publisher, and it contained the confession, it contained the trial transcripts, and another very important document written by the brother of the victim, Leander Sharp. But it also, this reader, includes these supposed letters that Anne Cook had written. It's called the Letters of Anne Cook. Now, the Letters of Anne Cook in this supposed primary source reader are transparently fraudulent. And if you understand what happened and you understand materially, you can see that this is really the first fictionalization or out-and-out fictionalization of the Kentucky tragedy. But yet, here it is in a document reader. And so what has then happened, that other historians who are just touching on the event for larger studies on gender before the Civil War or violence or whatever, they furthered this misconceptions by drawing upon the Letters of Anne Cook as if they were real. And then you have Jereboam and Anna writing a confession for their own purposes. Anyway, so when you first confront all this, it is an absolute mess. And I said it, I went into this just with, high hopes and wow, I'm going to straighten this out, but it was just very difficult. But again, I think I came up with a very viable story that what really did happen, because you can triangulate, so to speak. You can say, okay, look, we got this document saying this, that document saying that, but this document actually has X amount of testimony by all these people who are backing up, and this is based on nothing but hearsay. And so you just have to use forensic methods after a while to figure out, okay, this is true, this isn't not. But there was so much misunderstanding, so much underbrush you had to clear out before you can understand the story. And then I talk about it when I teach methods courses about, look, this is when you go to the primary sources, it's not like they just speak to you. You have to come at them critically, and you have to disentangle the various motives of the people who produce those documents. So anyway, it was a puzzle after a while. It became a sort of a mystery of its own. But once I did get to clear it away, it's like, oh, okay, I see what these guys are doing. These guys are telling people, Beauchamp and Cook are telling people what they want to hear. And if that, that's the basic point of the book. You can tell people what you want to hear, and you can almost get away with murder. And it's kind of a, sad fact, as Paul Simon said, people hear what they want to hear and disregard the rest. And that's really, because what they said aligned so perfect with the romantic ideals that were contained in the literature. And so it just took off. And so it's really a story of a self-promotion at the expense of reality in the effort to escape execution.
It seemed almost very modern in the sense of you could see them if they had access to Instagram or if they had access to whatever form of social media. I feel like they'd have been very adept at deploying those or using them to sort of drum up support.
Exactly. They are using this is a persona that they have created, or two personas that they created. And this is, it's very similar to what many people do on social media all the time. And again, it's really shocking how successful it was.
But that leads me to my final question, and I got to this topic and I wanted to ask you on as a guest because it becomes known as the Kentucky tragedy. I'm not an expert on crime in the early republic, but I would imagine that other murders happened and that they could have been equally salacious or had a lot of these sort of interesting details. So is there a reason, or do you have sort of a speculation as to why this particular event in Frankfort, Kentucky led to people as diverse as Edgar Allan Poe and Robert Penn Warren to actually take this up as a story and try to unpack it and write about it? Like, what is it that sort of lends the Kentucky tragedy to become a part of the more popular imagination?
First of all, I think you're exactly right to ask the question, why? The early republic's a very violent time. I don't think that's appreciated enough. There are so many well-known murderers. And by the way, the custom of writing a confession was very, very widespread as well. The confessions that you can unearth in the antebellum era, as some historians have done, are just seemingly unendless. But the difference is most of these confessions are basically that, I did it, I'm sorry, and it has this sort of almost religious sense of I'm trying to be forgiven for what I did. And this is where Jereboam Beauchamp and Anna Cook are different. They're not confessing truly, really to anything. They are saying they're trying to find exoneration, but they're using a means, the confession, which most people say, oh, this is the part where the accused, the condemned, admit to what really happened, right? But rather than doing that, they make this story up. And then they make that story up using these romantic cliches that people wanted to hear. And there it is, romantic cliches that people wanted to hear. And that's why it took off, because it's a sign of their brilliance, if you want to use that word, or their shrewdness, or their however you want to describe it, but that they managed to almost pull this off. And time and time again, he, for example, during the confession, he said, I did it out of honor, out of honor, out of honor. And he had no use for honor. I mean, he stabbed a man when in the middle of the night, when he opened up his door. That's the last thing a quote unquote honorable man would do according to the dictates of the antebellum era. There's nothing romantic about honorable about this, but he could step outside the roles that young men and women were supposed to enact and manipulate. It's almost pre-sociological the way these two do that. And so I think there's a certain real awareness of what they're doing, and just a wildness, just a lack of concern for other people. So after they murder this guy, and really their motive is that they heard someone say, they heard that Sharp said, this baby cannot be mine because the baby was black. That's all that set them up. At the end of the day, that's why Beauchamp murdered Sharp. And that's what set him off. And it was nothing to do about seduction or murder. It's just that he had heard, because of Sharp had re-entered politics, and that old story of seducing Ann Cook came up, he was told, although there's no evidence that this became an issue during the election, Beauchamp was told that Sharp was using that story to get reelected in 1825. And that, by the way, is the connection we mentioned earlier about him Sharp getting back into politics, and why that led directly to his assassination. So if you look at it objectively, what we've got here is a pretty sordid murder, because this guy was outraged that at the thought that someone was saying his wife had slept with the black man, and he murders another guy. But that they could take this unpromising story and turn it into this literary creation is really testament to their talents. Again, but I do find them hard to admire, because they were more than willing to kill a man over a rumor. So at the end of the day, it was due to their own ability to manipulate the culture that is why the tragedies become so well known.
Well, I really do hope our listeners will get the book and check it out, because as I said before when we started, I had never heard of the Kentucky tragedy before. So all of this was sort of new. When I first started reading it, I really thought it was going to be more of this explains sort of Southern honor and Kentucky. And then the whole dip into literary romanticism just got me like, okay, that makes complete sense as to why and how these people are writing and responding. And then Byron and Poe gets thrown in there. So it's a very sort of interesting look at all of those different things.
It was a bit of a challenge because there's so little historiography on Romanticism and these themes you're talking about. And so I kind of had to sort of, I don't want to say blaze a trail, but try to theorize a lot of this myself. But I do hope in the future this notion of Romanticism is recognized for how important it was, and not just in literary sense, not just in the sense of transcendentalist up in New England. These ideals and this basic conception of reality of the counter-enlightenment of the Romantic era is very, very influential and explains so much, but I think is so under-researched.
I honestly, for my own research, I'd only heard of it in the context of the U.S.-Mexican War and sort of 1840s onward, the idea that, when the U.S. goes to war with Mexico, that it was very much sort of imbibing those romantic notions.
Yeah, I think it has a whole lot to do with especially the South, and part and parcel of this Romanticism is their obsession with Sir Walter Scott and these medieval tropes and themes that I think were very influential. Lynn Hunt, who was a historian at UCLA, a French historian of French history, and she's written a book about how the rise of the novel in the late 18th century, Inventing Human Rights, I think is the name of it, was so important in the rise of humanitarianism and the ability to imagine other people as having as worthy of sympathy, and that the imagining people through novel reading especially was one of the key moments in this transition that so obviously happened in the late 18th century. And so I wish I would have had that book to use when I wrote the Murder and Madness, but I do think there is growing recognition that the literatures and the stories we tell are very, very influential. And it becomes a little weird because if, it's not like, oh, someone reads about a murder and then they go murder someone, or
right.
It's anything like that, but that the stories we tell really influence our basic conceptions of how the world works. Personally, I think that's one reason a lot of people today think the world is so dangerous, is because we watch such violent images all the time, which, I'm not condemning, I do it as well, but I think that leads to a basic conception. Doesn't make us more violent, but I think it makes us more prone to think that the world is violent, right? Anyway, so the way we consume, what stories we read and we watch is tremendously influential today and then. And the stories they were telling themselves back then, these romantic stories, were very, very influential.
I think that's a really good way to end the podcast. So thank you so much for coming on today and joining me and talking about this great book.
Oh, thank you very much.
If you travel to Bloomfield in Nelson County today, you can find the tombstone of the Beauchamps. Unlike most markers, the Beauchamps includes an elaborate poem, a testament to their abiding love of Lord Byron and the Romantic poets. The poem concludes, quote,
Then turn and see the villain low, and here let fall the grateful tear. Daughter of virtue, moist thy tear, this tomb of love and honor claim. For thy defense thy husband here laid down in youth his fame. His wife disdained a love forlorn, without her love's honored lord. Then reader hear their fortunes mourn, who for their love their life blood poured. Thanks to Dr. Matthew Schoenbachler for sharing his research today.
Kentucky Chronicles is funded by the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. Our show is produced by Gregory Hardison and edited by Gregory Meyer, with support from Dr. Stephanie Lang. To learn more about our publication of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. That's history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and be sure to tell your friends and colleagues.